I'm Andy Agathangelo. You probably all know that, but just in case there's anybody with us today that's been introduced to us from others, I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a very, very, very hard-working community of people around the world who really do want the financial system to work better. We are passionate about the work that we do, and the reason we're passionate about it is because there is so much importance to be placed on having a financial system that is actually doing its job properly, which is essentially to serve society. And of course, financial systems around the world have financial regulators, and of course, financial regulators have a very tough job to do. And part of that job is about creating a safe, stable, well-governed marketplace that people can have trust and confidence in. I'm pretty sure all regulators around the world accept that having a kind of credibility building role is important. So it's an important topic. I want to make one point very, very clear. We are all about driving change, and making change happen is a very, very important thing to do. Our approach is collaborative. Our approach is collegiate, it's civilized, it's consultative, it's all those kind of qualities. And I'm emphasizing this because our approach is not adversarial or combative. We're not about picking a fight with anybody. We are, of course, very, very happy to be constructively critical about anything, including the regulators, but we always want to get the balance right. Of course, it's a matter of opinion about what is the right balance. And what I've learned over the last 5.5 years, having built and led the Transparency Task Force, is that if you want to make change happen, you have to find ways to engage, to have dialogue with all the people that matter. And there really are two groups that really do matter. On one hand, there are those that we characterize as having a sense of passion and purpose for all the change that we want to see. And that, of course, includes the many people within our community. There are approximately 2,700 of them around the world. The other group that are also very, very important are the group that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible. So if somebody were to say to me, what is the Transparency Task Force's strategy for driving change? Very simply, it's about finding ways to bring these two groups together. That means dialogue. It means taking time to understand each other's points of view. So let me be crystal clear about what this session is not about. This session is not about being aggressive or critical for the sake of it. It's about being constructively critical with a view to finding ways to make a difference. And I want to maintain a reasonably harmonious and cordial demeanor throughout the session. I also want people to speak the truth as they see it, because this is the environment where you can do that. The Transparency Task Force is answerable to nothing and nobody other than my conscience. And I'm very, very happy for people to say what they truly feel. All I'm asking is that you be mindful that if we want to make change happen, that means we need to go about it in a reasonably constructively critical way, as opposed to just critical way. I think it's important that we say this. Despite the fact that we have no real power, no real influence, no real resource, we've managed to do a few pretty cool things over the last few years relating to engagement with regulators and parliamentarians, etc., etc., etc. I don't think there's any need for me to spend time talking about that today. All I will say is that I am absolutely convinced that if sufficient numbers of people are able to gather evidence to demonstrate why change is needed, then there's a chance that we can actually make change happen. And many of you will be aware that we are very, very much tuned into the philosophy that small groups of people working collaboratively really can make a difference. Now, today's event, I should say, because we have a few folks outside the UK, today's event is very, very important, and I'm going to share with you why. Over the last 5.5 years, I've had umpteen conversations with people who have absolutely convinced me that from their point of view, there is something wrong with the regulatory framework. They're giving me reasons why, anecdotal evidence why, sometimes Harvard evidence why they are able to come to the conclusion that it's not working. Not only would they say it's not working for consumers, i.e. it is failing to protect them and it's failing to drive out good outcomes, it's also failing the industry itself. There are many financial planners, for example, that I know who routinely talk about bureaucratic, clunky, burdensome regulation that doesn't really work. And a very, very good friend of mine actually said to me about 10 days ago that the regulatory environment actually takes up so much time and effort that it actually detracts from him doing a good job for his clients. So it would appear as though there are some pretty serious issues. Some of you who read the Transparency Times might have noticed that on Monday we circulated a link to the debate that took place in Parliament. I believe the date was the 1st of February 2016. And the date was all about the question, what should the future of the Financial Conduct Authority be? And if you watch that debate, you'll come to the same conclusions, I'm sure, that I've come to, which is that for several years, there have been serious questions about the effectiveness of the regulatory framework that we have. So this event is important. We are very likely to be doing some things as a consequence of this event, and we'll come on to those particular points in a moment. Therefore, please do not think that this event is some event in isolation. It's actually part of a reasonably well considered plan, and that plan is all about trying to create opportunities to shine a big bright light on potential improvements within the regulatory framework. We have some wonderful speakers today. We've got in our Just a Minute round, we've got Steve Farrell, Paul Gregory, Philip Meadowcroft, Peter O'Donnell, all of whom ideally we'd listen to for 10, 15, 20 minutes or so, but they're going to give 1 minute kind of précis of what they think. We've also got William May, Andy Keats, Edward Lucas, Helen McGregor, Brian Basham, Prem Seeker, I should say, forgive me, Baron Seeker. We've got Andy Shmulo, and I'll come back to Andy in a minute. And we've also got Mark Bishop. So there's a really, really full program. There will be times when you'll want to share your thoughts and opinions, when you'll want to ask questions. Please do that. I encourage you, because we have so many people here. I think we've got over 40 people. So many people here. Please use the chat. Put your questions into the chat. Put your thoughts into the chat. The chat will be circulated to all participants. So let's use the chat as a working crib sheet for us all to refer to. In a moment, I'm going to be inviting Mark Bishop to share a particular thought with you. And I frankly think that Mark's going to share a very, very important point with you. But before we go to Mr. Mark Bishop, we're going to hear from my colleague, Alexandra Zitkus, Head of Events for the Transparency Task Force, who's going to deal with a couple of operational housekeeping points for me. So Alexandra, over to you, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just a few quick things. So first of all, we are recording this session and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel, TTF TV, in a couple of weeks, probably. But if there's anything you regret saying that you don't want to be included in the recording, please just let me know. I'll put my email address in the chat. And as Andy said, I'll be circulating the chat tomorrow in a follow-up email. And just finally, if you are able to or want to, you can help us by tweeting during the event, just to get the word out there. That would be great. So I'll put our Twitter handle as well in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Alexandra. Okay, I'm going to share a few, I'm going to share my screen to show you a few slides relating to one or two things, and then we'll go straight to Mark Bishop for an important point. The first thing I want to do is explain how we contextualize this event within the Transparency Task Force community. I want you to understand where the idea of this event has come from, so to speak. So what I'm going to get you to look at now is this webpage. It's Transparency Task Force's webpage about our groups. We have 20 groups, far more than we can cope with, but somehow we're coping. We always just do the best we can. We have 20 groups. There's one I want to draw your attention to, because if you're at this event, and you are, then it's quite likely you should be in a particular group that we've recently formed, and you might not yet have had the memo, so to speak, and you therefore might not yet be in it. But this new group that we are going to be talking about is a group that we call Regulators Watch. We think that keeping an eye on what the regulators are doing, stroke are not doing, is a really healthy thing for any society to do. And we feel the need to have a group doing exactly that. I guess we feel the need to do that because we don't see sufficient scrutiny from coming from other places. So that is what our Regulators Watch group is all about. Like all of our groups, we have Zoom meetings from time to time, roughly once every 3 months. The next Zoom meeting is January the 7th, Thursday, January the 7th, 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. UK time. Like all of our groups, it's free to participate. Tomorrow, Alexandra will be circulating the notes from today's session. And when she does so, she'll be mentioning many things, one of which is this group. And what we'll be doing, if everyone wants it to happen, if you don't, just tell us, we'll put you all into the Regulators Watch group. If for some reason you don't want to be in it, that's absolutely fine. We'll just let you tell us that and we'll take you out of it. So it's important that you know that this event has come from ideas developed within Regulators Watch, that group. And we are going to be keeping a close eye on what the regulatory activity in the UK is. Not only the UK, but also internationally. For those of you that aren't yet aware, we've got a pretty big international footprint that will be evidenced tonight from our first main speaker, apart from anything else. So that's what that was all about. The next thing I want to talk to you about is our subscription model. We are successfully moving from an event management model where people pay to attend events to a subscription model, which is more in keeping with the community that we are building. And for those of you that don't know, our vision is to build a highly respected, international, influential institution that is dedicated to helping ensure that the financial services industry treats the consumer fairly. That's what we're doing. That's what the Transparency Task Force is all about. And to do that, we need a membership base that provides us with a sufficient resource to make that work. And for that to happen, we have our new subscription membership. Now, it's the most progressive, non-commercially minded subscription model anywhere. And in all honesty, I'm very confident that everybody can afford to become a member, because there are 4 options. Either pay £480 plus VAT once a year, or pay £135 a quarter every quarter, or £50 a month. Or option 4, and this is the important point, if you cannot afford that, it is okay. Don't panic. Become a subscription member by telling us how much you want to pay. And there is no minimum. We have some people paying £20 a month, some paying £30 a month, some paying £15 a month. We have some members paying £1 a month, and that gets them full access to everything that we're doing. So everybody can afford to become a subscription member. What we want is for everybody to be a subscription member so that we can basically level the load across as many people as possible, and that will give us the resource we need to do what we want to do. We're currently operating at a small fraction of what we're capable of, and I'm often told by many people that they are surprised just how much we are doing. Frankly, I'm pretty surprised by it sometimes as well, but the reality is we could do much more, and we could do what we do much better if we have the resource to do it. So that's what our subscription membership model is all about. Please do your part by becoming a subscription member, and effectively you decide the terms upon which to do that. We can't think of a fairer model than that. I'm very comfortable with the ethics of it, the morality around it. I'm proud that we've come up with such a progressive, non-commercial, community-orientated membership model. I could talk for ages because we've got so much to say about tonight's subject. But I'll hold it there. I'm now going to invite Mark Bishop to talk to you about an initiative that we think is very, very important. Once Mark's made his points, I'll perhaps elaborate with a bit more information. But Mr. Mark Bishop, can I please invite you to take yourself off mute if you haven't done also already, and share with us the point that you're going to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm going to ask everybody in this symposium 2 small favours. But first, I'm going to explain to you why I'm going to ask you those favours. So Andy very kindly invited me to speak this evening, you know, usual 10-minute slot. And initially it was going to be about, did the FCA need reform? And I kind of thought, well, it's not really fair to criticise them when they're not around to defend themselves. And it's also not very productive just to come out with a list of criticisms. Much better, surely, to have a positive presentation about how it could be improved. I went and drafted that thing, and I realised I could not do it in 10 minutes. And rather than produce something I was not proud of, I said to Andy, well, what else can we do? And he said, why not produce a white paper on the topic? And so that's what I'm going to do. But I don't think it should just be mine. I think it should speak for and on behalf of those of us from TTF who believe that there is scope to improve the FCA and have constructive ideas as to how that can be done. So to that end, I have 2 favours to ask you, not really for my benefit, but so that I can help TTF. The first one is I would be grateful if you could summarise for me in 1 sentence your view of the FCA. Good, bad, or indifferent, different. I want the truth. Okay. The second one is, please, in no more than a paragraph, come up with 1 idea for how the FCA might do things better, might be improved. I'm not talking about something here that requires primary legislation. Could be something that requires secondary legislation, you know, just a few lines, couple of words changed in the Acts of Parliament, or it could be something that is very operational, that the FCA could do itself if the idea had occurred to it, or if it was willing to make that change. Okay, now I'm going to put into the chat in a moment my email address, and if you could possibly, not necessarily this evening, but maybe tomorrow or the next few days, or even over the Christmas break, if you could just drop me those 2 things, 1 sentence on your honest view of the FCA, and the other one is 1 idea, no more than a paragraph, for how you would improve it, that does not need huge amounts of legislation, no legislation at all, or just a minor change. And I will then take on board all of those thoughts. We can perhaps discuss them at the first of those Regulators Watch meetings on 7th of Jan. And I can start working on a document on the basis of those inputs. Is that a fair request?
I reckon it certainly is, Mark. Thank you so much for offering to do that. It's a really constructive, positive thing to do. It's basically a kind of a brainstorm around ideas. I'm sure within those ideas there'll be some absolute crackers. Some will be very familiar to us already. Somebody's bound to come up with something we've never thought of before, never heard of before, and could actually prove to be quite useful. In a moment, I'm going to be asking Sam Kent to introduce himself. Sam works for the FCA. Sam is involved with the PR activity at the FCA. I want everybody to know that we do have somebody from the FCA here today, but Sam is not here, and I'm going to stress this, Sam is not here today to speak for the FCA or to take criticism on behalf of the FCA. We've invited Sam here to simply observe the proceedings, so to speak, and we think that's a really healthy thing to do. So Sam, could I please invite you to take yourself off mute and just briefly, please be brief, introduce yourself to everybody here today, Sam. Thank you very much.
Of course, no problem. Nice to meet you again, Andy. Yeah, hi, I'm Sam Kent. I'm the manager of the public affairs team at the FCA, and very much appreciate the invite. And I'm just, as Andy said, I'm here to listen, and yeah, here to listen. And thank you again.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Sam being here to listen, I think is very, very important. It's the beginnings of what we hope will be a very constructive, perhaps challenging, perhaps even awkward, but a very constructive dialogue between the Transparency Task Force and the Financial Conduct Authority, because we want the FCA to work as well as it possibly can. I'm sure the FCA wants it to work as well as it possibly can as well. Okay, I'm about to invite our next speaker to join us. Our speaker wasn't going to be a speaker until about, I think it was 8 o'clock this morning or even earlier. And I had a proper conversation with Dr. Andy Schmulo. And I was absolutely blown away by the relevance and frankly, the timeliness of the conversation with Dr. Schmulo, because what he was saying to me chimed so much with the thinking that's being developed within the Transparency Task Force. Now, I'm going to read to you, I hope Andy doesn't mind me doing this, I don't think he will. I'm going to read to you the opening note I sent Andy, I should say Dr. Schmulo, sorry, after we had the conversation today, just to give you a feel for the level of appreciation that Dr. Schmulo is speaking with us today. Here's the email that I sent just after we spoke. I'm reading it out verbatim. Dear Andy, thank you so much for your time just now. It was a spookily timely conversation. They say the universe conspires to help people with clearly defined goals and good intent. I mention that because I have had hundreds of great conversations with people this year, and I think the conversation we just had is right up there as one of the most significant of all of them. It's as if I'm trying to get somewhere in the dark and I've just found a helpful kindred spirit with a powerful torch who can help to guide the way. Your insight and experience is hyper relevant to what we want to do, and I'll always remember your willingness to get up at 4:30 your time to help us. And the reason why Dr. Andy Schmulo is getting up, or got up at about 4:30 a.m. his time, is because he's on the other side of the world. And those of you who know, Australia has gone through a very interesting time recently. And we are absolutely convinced that there is huge learning opportunity in looking at what's been happening in relation to Australia. And I'd like to now invite Dr. Schmulo to share his thoughts as a very special and a very welcome guest. And please, folks, when it comes to showing our appreciation to Dr. Schmulo, go crazy. It took a lot to get up at 4:30 a.m. his time to do that. So, Dr. Schmulo, over to you, please. Share your thoughts for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for a bit of Q&A after that. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andy, and please feel free to call me Andy, or if it's easier, just hey you. This is a very large group of people, and many of whom are of great eminence, and so it's a privilege to be asked to speak to you, and I appreciate it, and I thank you most respectfully for your time. So my speciality, my research specialization is in driving good conduct in Twin Peaks regulatory regimes. And for those of you who are familiar with the Twin Peaks model, you will know that it is in operation in the United Kingdom and Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and Belgium. It's a regulatory model that was devised by an Englishman by the name of Michael Taylor, and he intended it for deployment in the United Kingdom, but it was in fact Australia that implemented it first, about in 1998 thereabouts, and it was after the global financial crisis that it was implemented in the United Kingdom. So we have the longest and most extensive experience with the Twin Peaks model, and our experience has been a painful one. We had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into misconduct in the financial industry, which handed down its report at the beginning of 2019. And there was about 10 years of misconduct that was constantly in the media, which gave rise to the Royal Commission. I was one of, if not the first academic in Australia to support the call for a Royal Commission, and I supported that call longer and more consistently than anybody else. And the misconduct that gave rise to the Royal Commission, well, it was shocking enough to give rise to a Royal Commission. But what came out at the Royal Commission was a bacchanalian feast of venality, of wickedness, of an absolute arrogated contempt for the law and active collusion by the regulators. So that then leads me to the next point I want to make, and that is that I had said, and others of my colleagues had said before the Royal Commission, that our regulators are captured. And that was, in exactly those words, one of the findings of our Royal Commission, that our regulators are captured, deeply captured, suborned to the industry. And as you have in the United Kingdom, we in Australia, we have a Twin Peaks model where our version of the FCA, called ASIC, is responsible for conduct, and our prudential regulator is responsible for system stability. Evidence came up at the Royal Commission of not just a systematic program of turning a blind eye, but at times active collusion. And if you delve into the scholarship, the scientific literature, the research into regulatory capture, you will see that there is evidence that regulators of any and every industry are susceptible to capture. Whether it's telecommunications or healthcare or oil and gas, they are all susceptible to capture, but none of them is as susceptible as the regulators of the financial industry. And the evidence shows overwhelmingly that the regulators of the financial industry are not only captured, they fall first and they fall furthest. This is not a criticism of financial system regulators per se. There are forces at work that are so subtle and so insidious that they're very difficult to identify, let alone combat. Let me give you an example. At the one end of the spectrum, you have capture that is caused by corruption. Somebody gets a brown paper bag full of money. But at the other end of the spectrum are regulators who go and are individuals who go and work for the regulator and have a particular ideological bent. And that ideological bent results in them believing that whatever is good for the banking industry is good for the country. Now, often what is good for the banking industry is good for the country, but not always. So, for example, in Australia, our Productivity Commission has said that our banking industry has become a cozy four-bank oligopoly, immune to competition, and that this is the reason why our banking industry is now the most or the second most profitable, depending on the time period you use, the most or the second most profitable banking industry in the world by ROE. It is an anomaly for an advanced, developed economy like Australia to have a banking industry that is regularly returning 13 and 14 and 15% return on equity. And our Productivity Commission has said it is those exorbitant returns that are the reason why there have been no real wage increases in Australia in the last 15 years. Our banking industry has become parasitic. And regulators who regulate that industry, who look at the banking industry and have this ideological notion that what's good for the banking industry is good for the country, will not seize the nettle because they don't see the problem. So I was called upon to provide some of my research to the Australian Royal Commission, which I did. And I'm pleased to say that the recommendation in my research was adopted as a formal recommendation of the Royal Commission. And that recommendation was contained in recommendation 6.14 of the Royal Commission final report, which was to establish a board of oversight over our regulators, or what I rather glibly call a regulator to regulate the regulator. Now, this suggestion is not entirely mine. My research is based on the writings of scholars dating back to the 1860s. I think in particular of Charles Francis Adams Jr., who, observing the manner in which the railroad commissions in the United States had been captured by the railroad barons, spoke of the need to establish a sunshine commission. And this is something that ties into the TTF's underlying philosophy. It is based upon a quote. It is based upon something said by the former United States Chief Justice, William Brandeis. He said, "There is no disinfectant more powerful than sunshine. There is no policeman more effective than the electric light." And what we saw at the Royal Commission in Australia was that the public opprobrium, the public naming and shaming, the publication, the dissemination into the public realm of the evidence about what the regulators had been up to created a stronger driver for those regulators to change what they had been doing than anything else in the preceding 20 years. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. When evidence of this collusion is put into the public domain, regulators have no choice. They have to step up and they have to start enforcing the law. I'm pleased to say that the suggestion for the establishment of a, as I put it, a regulator to regulate the regulator has now been ventilated by our federal government, and we currently have legislation before our federal parliament, the Financial Regulator Assessment Authority Bill, which will, for the first time since these suggestions were first made in the 1860s, establish a Sunshine Commission. No doubt there are many of you who are listening to this who are saying, yes, but what happens if the regulator who regulates the regulator becomes captured? And I don't have the opportunity at this point to go into all the details, but I can assure you we've thought about that long and hard. We've thought about how it is that you go about building an insulation around this board of oversight to insulate it from capture, so that it will provide its reviews of the regulator at arm's length, that they will be independent, that they will be critical when necessary, and most importantly, as soon as they are made available, they are put into the public domain. We've put a great deal of thought, and I've teamed up in my research with an industrial psychologist to ensure that there are mechanisms in place to make sure that membership of the Board of Oversight is comprised of people who are not beholden to the industry, who are not former members of the industry, who are not beholden to the regulator, who are not former members of the regulator, who have a sufficiently high profile in the public domain and who are sufficiently secure in their own income, to put it bluntly, that they are able to engage in this kind of work in a manner that will put the public benefit first. And the last thing I want to say to you, I'm sure I've run out of time, Andy, I'm sorry if I've been rabbiting on for too long. The last thing I want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is this. In the work that I've been involved in this respect in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa. South Africa has recently adopted a Twin Peaks model, and I helped the South African government draft their legislation. In those countries that I've mentioned and in others, in Canada, people around the world look to the United Kingdom for leadership. If you look at the Companies Acts in Australia and South Africa and New Zealand and Canada, you will see that they are based on your Companies Act. I'm assisting the South African government in the implementation of a treating customers fairly regime in South Africa. That's based on your TCF regime. When it comes to the manner in which your regulators conduct themselves and the manner in which and the type of legislation that you enact, many countries around the world follow your leadership. It is for that reason alone that it is so important that if your regulatory regime is not working, you need to fix it, and you need to fix it now. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I can see Baron Seeker putting his hands together to show his appreciation. I'd like us all, please, to take time to do that. That was wonderful. It really was wonderful. And bear in mind, folks, it's Andy hasn't even had a chance to have his breakfast yet. That was really, really, really spot on. The reason I was so excited, having spoken to Andy earlier today, is because I think that what Andy sets out and the thinking behind the Royal Commission, I just see so many parallels between the reasons why it was called for in Australia to what I hear day after day after day in relation to the UK situation. So who knows? Maybe the way forward for us as a country is to take a real honest look at what's been going on and to really investigate that as forensically and as analytically as possible. I know there are members of this audience today who are absolutely convinced that something like what Andy has just set out is absolutely necessary for our country to regain credibility from a regulatory framework point of view. So this is tough talking. I'm so grateful to you, Andy, for spending time with us today. I really am hugely, hugely grateful. We're going to squeeze in time for a couple of questions. Dr. Shmula, I would invite you please to put your, if you're happy, to put your contact details or perhaps your LinkedIn profile into the chat. I know there'll be so many people who will want to engage with you and talk to you about this because you've really just covered the kickoff of this meeting so well. Please wave your hand at me or similar if you would like to put a point now, but I have to ask everybody to be very, very concise with your question or comment. And I would invite Andy to also be very concise in his response as well. Of course, if what you want to talk about requires further dialogue, you can always connect afterwards. We can do that. So please wave something at me, folks, if you'd like to ask a question. Helen Scott. Helen Scott's a wonderful, wonderful TTF ambassador. She really is. So Helen, I'm very pleased that you would like to say something. Helen, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, Andy, my head's getting bigger and bigger. Dr. Andy, that was fabulous. I've got one question. I'm not sure whether you or anybody else can answer it. What do you think treating customers fairly actually means? Because the FCA doesn't appear to be able to answer this.
You know, I've seen very encouraging use of TCF in South Africa, and they've taken the ball from the United Kingdom and they've really run with it. And they've taken the 6 principles of TCF that you folks have implemented. And they started off by saying to banks in 2011, or banks and all financial industry firms, here's a treating customers fairly regime. It's aspirational. That's all. No pressure. It's just aspirational, which was a very shrewd move because it meant the banking industry didn't push back. They said, oh, if it's aspirational, that's fine. We can just ignore it. As time went by, the South African regulators started saying to financial institutions, you don't have to follow TCF. Of course, it's merely aspirational. But when you come and speak to us, we'd like to know if you're not following TCF, why not? And then a little while later, they said to them, we're changing the rules of the game. TCF will now be a legal requirement. And if we find instances where you don't comply with it, we don't have to seek a court order to fine you. We have the power under the legislation to fine you, and we are itching for an opportunity to do so. And I consult widely to the industry in South Africa. They are deeply observant of TCF because they are deeply frightened of the regulator. And that's important. The regulator in South Africa commands respect because the industry knows they're looking for an opportunity to make an example of someone.
And conversely, let me ask, if I may, indulge with a question from me. So in the UK, as I know you know, Andy, we have the senior manager certification regime, which looks like a brilliant framework to make individuals at a senior level accountable. And the only thing wrong with it, as I can see, is that it's actually not applied very much or very well. Why? Why do you think there appears to be a reluctance for our conduct regulator to use the power the conduct regulator has got?
When it comes to using that power, they're asked to use that power against individuals who are able to command resources for their defense that might be greater than the resources available to the state for their prosecution. So you're going to be up against an armada of lawyers and the best and most expensive lawyers in town, and regulators don't have the stomach for the fight. My response is, if the armada of lawyers representing the bank executive are giving you a hard time, you just haven't made the law strict enough. Tweak the law until you can start putting people in jail. Fining banks and financial institutions where the chief executive has to pay a fine with other people's money, would you believe, has no effect on them. It's only when we start putting chief executives in jail that things will change.
Thank you, Andy, so much. I'm going to invite anybody else to make a point if they'd like to. Please wave at me if you do.
I see Mr. Farrell waving.
Yes, indeed. We'll go to Steve Farrell. Thank you, Steve. Please be concise for me. Thank you, Steve. And take yourself off mute first.
Hi, Dr. Schmooner. Your academic qualifications exceed mine by some measure of star drive, really. Did you consider the fundamental nature of banking in this? That is, the current fractional reserve banking settlement will generate these problems, whatever you do. Did you sort of look at it from first principles?
Absolutely, Mr. Farrell. This is a phenomenon known as well, in some quarters it's known as a feedback loop, in other quarters it's known as a doom loop. The banking industry is in a position, due to the nature of fractional reserve banking and due to the fact that they are so interlinked through the payment system, they're in a position where they're able to say, if you punish us, we might get wobbly. And if we get wobbly and we fall over, we're not going to pay, you're going to pay. So back off. This becomes this feedback loop of misconduct, generating financial crises, generating taxpayer-funded bailouts, generating a deep commitment from politicians never to bail out again, followed by another series of financial crises and bailouts. And sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I've just asked a supplementary. Yeah, I appreciate all that. I really do. What I'm getting at is you lauded our abilities to frame things like the Companies Act, but do you also appreciate that it's the fault of the English that we have this fractional reserve banking we've got now with the 1770s Acts and the 1830s Bank Charter Acts, leaves us with an unstable system. Had you looked at the stabilising the system fundamental principles?
Yes and no. There is, so in the English-speaking world, there is an appetite to follow, for example, United Kingdom, but there isn't an appetite to go to follow exemplars from the non-English speaking world. I think that's a shame. I think that the German model of corporate governance, known as Mitbestimmung, stands for co-determination, is more successful, it's more balanced. It doesn't lead to the kind of excesses that we've seen in the Anglo-American jurisdictions. I think that it's very sensible. Companies over 500 people, half the board has to come from the workforce. So there is a degree to which I've looked beyond the Anglo-American tradition, but in terms of the countries where I conduct research or provide advice, there is limited appetite, and it's for the worst reasons. I asked the foremost expert on companies law in Australia a little while ago what he thought of Mitbestimmung, and he said, "I've never heard of it." "What is it?" And I said, "It's the German model of co-determination." He said to me, "I don't read German."
May I just make one statement? I consider the current banking settlement a state-sanctioned, special privileged, cartelised supplier of a monopoly product engaged in counterfeiting.
There we go. Thank you, Steve. We'd love to have the time to develop these conversations further. I know they would be very, very interesting, but what we are going to do now, folks, is put our hands together to show appreciation once again to Andy, because I think TTF has got a wonderful friend. Here's somebody who's been directly involved with what's been happening down under, and we can learn a great deal from. So, Andy, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Okay, if you can stay awake and if you can resist the temptation to go back to bed, please be with us for the rest of the session. Folks, what I'm going to do now is spend a minute sharing something with you, which is very, very important, and then we're going to go straight to Baron Prem Seeker. What I'm sharing with you is violation tracking. Now, some of you have seen this before. It is a wonderful, wonderful utility for anybody that wants to improve the way the world works. We have a massive project on the go that's taking up lots and lots of time and energy to bring Violation Tracker to the UK. The reason we want to do that is because we believe it's a huge driver of positive change. What Violation Tracker does, it tracks violations. So here we have all the industries in the USA ranked by how bad they are in terms of infringement, corporate infringements. Financial services is the worst offender. Now, I could spend ages explaining why. It is insane that the one industry that has to be trusted to function successfully behaves in the least trustworthy way. It is absolutely insane that that is the case, but that is the case. $325 billion worth of fines, worse than oil and gas and pharmaceuticals and motor vehicles and utilities put together. It's something like 7 times the number 2. If this was a horse race, we'd be saying that the financial services horse was drugged with steroids or something. It's so far ahead. This points to there being something systemically, fundamentally, weirdly wrong with financial services, which I think is a very, very important point. But when you dig into the data even further, you get to even more powerful data. Here are the 10 worst offending organizations. Very powerful information, but look at this. And this is the key point that has been spoken about so far in our session today. Banks that get fined for misconduct do not appear to change their behavior. That would suggest that the entire regulatory framework is failing to do what it's designed to do, which is to bring about good, healthy, trust-building market conduct. The same organizations are being fined for doing the same things over and over again. This is recidivism. This is where being caught and told off, fined, imprisoned, or whatever, doesn't actually make a difference. We are working very hard with Violation Tracker and approximately 20 stakeholders to bring Violation Tracker to the UK. We then want to get it into Canada. We want to get it into Australia. We want this to be an international resource. So one of the things that Alexandra will mention when she circulates the notes tomorrow is, would you like to be part of the TTF project to bring Violation Tracker to the UK? There's already a wonderful head of steam built up around that, and we're looking for more volunteers. As you know, TTF is a people-driven engine for change. So you've got to get involved. You've got to do your bit to help the cause to be more than just a talking shop. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. We're now going to go to Baron Seeker, who, for those of you that don't know, is an incredibly well-respected academic, now member of the House of Lords. Baron Seeker, we know you've got some very, very clear and very well-formed views around the topic of regulatory reform and what needs to happen. Please take 10 minutes to share your thoughts with us, and I'm very, very grateful for you for being with us, Prem. Thank you very much indeed. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My first word to Andy, none of this Baron-like, please. I'm just Prem Seeker. Just the Baron somehow gets me in the Legislative Assembly, and that is something that is just to facilitate change. It's my great pleasure to follow Andy Shumulo, because I visited Wollongong a couple of times in the last few years and enjoyed my time there, and I still have good colleagues there. Just to add, the last Labour manifesto in last year had a policy which was that if had Labour come to power, there would have been an independent public inquiry into the finance industry. To some extent that was influenced by the Australian Royal Commission, but not entirely, because what we wanted to do was not only examine the corporate executives under oath and subpoena documents, but also enable the victims to speak. So that it's a bit like the Truth Commission in South Africa. Go and speak to your torturers and see what they actually have to say when they face you face to face. But as you know, Labour didn't really get in. But nevertheless, the idea is still around. We currently have a financial services bill going through the House of Commons. Some MPs will attempt to resurrect that policy. When it comes to the House of Lords, I shall attempt to resurrect that policy. We know what the government's response is going to be, but we all know that many of the things that we enjoy today, whether it is right to have it enjoy in a trade union or right to vote or right to equality, just didn't happen overnight. We need to put certain markers down. So I was very pleased to hear lots of things which Andy said, and they will resonate with lots of things which I'm going to say as well. So just to make sure that you're not just looking at me, but also got something to read. Can you see this, this set of slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right, okay. So I'm going to talk to a report which is publicly available. It was prepared for the Labour Party in January 2019, and it was a year, 18 months work, talking to lots of people along the way, corporate executives, victims, including we also spoke to the Chief Executive of FCA, Andrew Bailey, and many other regulators as well. So I'm going to look at that. We may not have people who probably question the need for regulation. Well, lots of groups we met, they wondered whether we need any kind of regulation. To me, that is insane. There is always regulation. It's the question of, do you have a public regulation or private form? Of course, without rules and practices, nothing really exists. But from my perspective, regulation is important. And the kind of regulation you get is important because it normalizes certain practices. It can empower and protect citizens. It encourages organizations to adopt good citizenship practices. It's got the capacity to curb malpractices, call culprits to account. And if you want the regulatory system to be decent, it's really got to hold culprits to account. There has to be swift retribution. And above all, what regulation does is produces a stable and cohesive society. People feel that there is a sense of justice. And it, of course, if system is seen to be just, it then promotes confidence in the business sector itself. So there are lots of positive things to be said. One only has to look at the field of sale of tobacco products or alcohol, and you can see how regulation can achieve many of these things. The issues often come down, do you want a hard regulation that is primarily based on legislation, which gives rights to people, assuming that the regulators are willing to respect that and enforce the law, or soft? The UK has oscillated between the two, and I think in most countries, probably there is a combination of the two, though the nature of that combination would perhaps vary depending on the history and traditions. But in UK, of course, banks and other financial organizations are also corporations, but we have a huge hole. Firstly, there is no enforcer of company law at all. It is all fragmented, a little bit with the FCA, a little bit with the Mergers and Monopolies Commission, little bit with the Financial Reporting Council, little bit with the Insolvency Service, and that is not really very good. A lot of corporate executives are kind of rewarded on the basis of profits they produce for shareholders. Therefore, they have every incentive, as it were, to milk stakeholders and exploit them. So in other words, I'm suggesting that we got to think about the nature of capitalism itself. Banks, insurance companies, pension funds interact with accounting, auditing, insolvency, and the power to make rules and force regulation there primarily is in private hands. So the bodies which produce accounting rules, auditing, insolvency in the main are even outside the freedom of information net. You can't even find out what they do, even though they are statutory regulators. There is very poor parliamentary scrutiny. I'd be happy to answer questions about that later. I have followed some of these things for about 50 years. So what do we have in the UK? Well, we planted 3 questions in Parliament, asked different ministers different questions, They all gave us different answers, meaning none of them even knew how many regulators there are. We think there are 700 plus, and you will find a list of them or indication of that in the report, which has the title of this talk. Just put my name on Google followed by that title and it will come up. We have at least 41, I think more, dealing with the finance industry alone. Now think about the duplication, waste, inefficiency, buck passing. We have 25 dealing with money laundering, 5 dealing with auditing, 5 dealing with insolvency. Incredible overlapping, duplicating, inefficient, and above all, they are all passive. So many people talk about the RBS HBOS frauds. Well, of course, insolvent, and nobody could have liquidated somebody's business without the involvement of insolvency practitioners. But insolvency regulators have done nothing. They're just waiting for complaints and the evidence to land in their lap, rather than looking at the newspaper headlines and other reports and going after them. There is very little public accountability. We don't have any stable regulatory structures. So until the BCCI in 1991, we had Bank of England as a regulator, and until the kind of secondary banking crash in the 70s, well, it was very light touch regulation, nudge and a wink and an elbow, that's about it. After the BCCI scandal, it becomes the Financial Services Authority. Well, then it becomes FCA and the PRA, who knows where we go next. So we've not been able to produce any stable structures. It is all dominated by the industry grandees, kind of revolving doors. And they are more concerned about protecting the industry rather than protecting the stakeholders, protecting the public. And the issue I like to normally push is cognitive capture. Academics amongst you would be familiar with theories of power, especially the work of Stephen Lukes, and he talks about how people's subjectivity is shaped. So these people's subjectivity is shaped in such a way that they are sympathetic to the finance industry. So in the House of Lords in the last few weeks, I raised a question about the corrupt practices in the finance industry. It was immediately dismissed by the minister to say, oh, well, they don't really do that. And I will return to that. Our regulatory system has been utterly ineffective in curbing predatory practices. And they have gone on for decades. And the regulatory system is a plaything of politicians. They intervene to prevent scrutiny. For example, BCCI shut down in July 1991, the biggest banking fraud of 20th century. To this day, there's been no investigation. And after 5.5 years of legal battle with the UK government, I secured one document. It is codenamed Sandstorm Report. You will find it on the internet. And that document shows that the bank was looted with the full approval of regulators and the government by people linked to Al-Qaeda, Saudi intelligence, and royal families in the Middle East. There's a little representation of masses on the regulatory bodies. So when I met the regulators, including Andrew Bailey, the question we ask is, what do you exist for? And the standard answer was, we serve the public interest. And then you ask, where exactly is the public? And how do you know what the public interest is so that you can serve it? At that time, you just get sort of blank looks. There is very poor public accountability. So we have had a banking crisis in this country in every decade since the 1970s, culminating in the big crash in 2007 and 8. Interest rates, exchange rates have been rigged. London is now the world's leading center for money laundering, tax avoidance, tax evasion is rife. They have missold every conceivable financial product. I already mentioned HBOS, RBS frauds. They're ripping off people on interest rate for loans, overdraft. There seems to be an ineffective system of dispute resolution, and hedge funds, private equity are busy dumping pension scheme liabilities, have a look at my report to the House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee on, for example, the collapse of Bernard Matthews and what private equity did. So what do we want the regulatory system to do? Following Andy, this is a point we already made, we needed to protect consumers, taxpayers, and the public from harmful practices. Want to promote some kind of stability and confidence. It is not the regulator's job, in our view, to promote the industry. That is down to the government and somebody else. If regulators have dual purpose, they will fail. So we want them to prioritize enforceable rights for citizens, provide transparency and accountability. We want the newly designed system to replace the current regulators where feasible. We don't want any private trade association or professional body to have a statutory role in regulation. We don't want regulators reporting to government departments. Take an example, HSBC, fined $1.9 billion in the US for involvement in money laundering. What do we know? George Osborne, the then Chancellor in the UK, secretly wrote to the US regulators asking them to go easy on HSBC. There was no investigation in the UK into HSBC. We want normal people in control. I'll explain what I mean by that. And we want sunshine, which Andy referred to. So this was the kind of a structure we came up with, which we recommended to Labour, and to the best of our knowledge, had it come to power, it would have probably taken a decade to implement fully. So what we want is some kind of a joined up system. For example, a business commission, okay? Underneath the business commission, a number of arms, okay? For example, a companies commission to enforce every aspect of company law. A finance commission, for example, dealing with the finance industry, and you can have any other number of commissions, X1 to XN, okay? But each of these sub-commissions here would have a supervisory board. Supervisory board would be made up of stakeholders, ordinary people like yourselves who are the victims. You can become responsible for appointing the day-to-day executives for company commission, finance commission, and other commissions. You will exercise a strategic oversight through the supervisory board. You will examine whether they are meeting their goals. Why are they taking so long or doing nothing about the RBS HBOS frauds? Okay, all the meetings of the supervisory boards would be in public. All the background papers would be publicly available. So each of these sub-commissions underneath will send a representative to the main business commission. Business commission itself will have a supervisory board, okay? So membership of this supervisory board at the top level will come from the sub-levels. So supervisory boards, remember, are made up of stakeholders. Alongside, we would have an independent enforcement commissioner, i.e. it's not the people who are making the rules and interpreting them, actually enforcing it. And there would be an ombudsman. But the whole structure would report to Parliament itself, not to any government department. Okay, so that was the kind of a structure which we recommended. And to some extent, as Andy indicated earlier, it was influenced by our study of corporate governance in Germany, except that we transported the idea of a supervisory board at the regulatory level rather than just at the corporate level. So in other words, this way people are in charge, people are there. Okay, it is not that they can provide a diversity of views to check cognitive capture. Yeah. We need a diversity of views. So the other changes we recommended, we want all financial products to be tested before they are launched to see what their capacity to destroy anybody is. We want personal liability for directors. We can't have limited liability protect them. It already protects shareholders, and the result is irresponsibility. They can collect dividends, but don't bear the consequences of malpractices. We want regular review of regulatory bodies or bodies. We want stakeholders on company boards, and that commitment was also in the Labour manifesto, that there would be employees on company boards, though we had recommended how about consumers as well, for example, for banks, insurance companies, subject to a qualification criteria, like saying, if you've been an employee, if you've been a consumer for a year, you meet certain criteria, well, why not? Okay, you be represented too, and then you can vote on executive pay as well. So we had recommended those things, and we didn't believe that this performance-related pay is a good idea. And if they want it, we want consumers and employees really to vote on it. Now, I have briefly sketched out things which are covered in about 110 pages of our report, which is publicly available, and I shall try to push it in coming days. And I'll be obviously delighted to take any questions as well. Wow, how time flies. And I think I've taken more than 10 minutes. Thank you very much for putting up with me.
Prem, thank you very much indeed for such a clear set of thoughts that seem to chime so well with TTS views generally, and also what Andy was speaking about earlier. Thank you very much, Prem. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to questions and comments. I'll always look for people who haven't yet had a chance to say something, so please wave something at me if you'd like to ask a question or make a point. We've got so many people. I need to look at different screens. Mark, I'll come to Mark Bishop if there isn't anybody else. Paul Gregory, then Lawrence Wormold. Paul, please take yourself off mute. I must ask everybody to be as concise as you possibly can be. Thank you, Paul. You're on mute, Paul. Oh, I think Paul's.
Yeah, that's it. I'd just like to say it's a wonderful project that is there, but the practice has been until now that the revolving door of people in the industry totally supervise it. Now, that is an immense barrier to break. It's custom, it's entrenched, and I don't know whether just the principle will be applied. I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get ordinary people into the supervisory boards. I think everywhere we turn, we see the people in the industry going into the regulators, and I don't know how effective any means can be to stop it. So that can be sorted. I'm sure we'll get there.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I'm going to go to Andy, because Andy Shmulo would like to respond to that, and I think it's appropriate that we invite Andy to do so. Andy, your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, the problem of the revolving door is a very serious one. And I'd like to bring to your attention the steps that they've taken in South Korea, where they have enacted legislation which prevents anyone who worked for a regulator working for a regulated entity, even if it's a regulated entity in a different industry, for 3 years after they depart the regulator. And I think that's very important. I think it's very important to cut this concession and reward loop that is evident in the revolving door. So look to South Korea, I would say, on that one.
Having your international perspective is really handy, Andy. Really handy, Andy. That wasn't intended. Mr. Lawrence Wormold, lovely to have you with us, Lawrence. Please share your thought. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a straightforward question, really, for the last presenter. Do you worry that the overt party political aspect of some of the proposals you've made will make them harder for people to accept? This doesn't look like a technocratic solution. It looks like you mentioned the Labour Party policy a couple of times. Do you worry that that's a good or a bad thing in terms of getting it discussed at the most senior levels?
Should I respond?
Yes, please, Prem, of course. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Excellent questions. Perhaps I'll start with the last comment first. We were an independent bunch of academics. We were asked by the Labour Party to prepare a report. And indeed, most of us at that time, and even now, were not really members of the Labour Party at all. There was no money involved. It was, as they say, labour of love, literally. No pun intended. And so we prepared the report after spending 12, 18 months looking at the issues, and that is what we come up with. At the end, we were pleased that some of those ideas were accepted and form part of Labour. I think at the end, it's inevitable if you want something to succeed, you got to sell it to political parties. It is not quite clear how else you're going to get public policy issues changed. Parliament is often reactive rather than proactive on issues. And as and when there is a crisis, you have to suggest that this is how it is, and it has to connect with some antenna. We did meet some Conservative politicians as well, including former chancellors, and I won't mention names. We also met one police and crime commissioner as well to discuss some of the things about some of these policies, and we found that they were quite, some of them were quite receptive, some not. So I can't give you a watertight answer. You may well be right in what you say. Supervisory board, difficult to get people. I think the point is that it is often ordinary people who are telling us what is wrong, be they journalists or people whose pension has been lost or investment has been lost, rather than so-called professionally qualified people. Okay, and the point I was making was that we need people from diverse walks of life with diverse views. We don't need people who are psychologically standardized. We need people, who can represent different worldviews. And that also relates to Andy's point as well. So refer to the South Korean practice, very good, very interesting. But the point is, other people you recruit, psychologically, they may be aligned with the industry. So industry frequently tells us that they have independent people, but their cognitive makeup is such that they will consider what is good for the industry first. What we are saying is you got to think about what is good for the people. If it is good for the people, they have confidence, and that from that it follows that that promotes confidence in the industry. So it's the other sort of a way around the loop. That is the way sort of we were looking at it. And we did many presentations as this report was prepared. I remember going to the City of London, making many a presentation on this to the leaders in the finance industry, investment association, and many other places, just to see what their reaction was. It's kind of interesting. At one level, their reaction was, we don't really mind what kind of a regulatory system as long as you can deal with the rogues. Until you pointed out that their own organization may itself have been a rogue, and referred to some examples, and they often would say, yeah, but we have changed. So it was kind of an interesting dialogue.
Thank you very much indeed, Prem. We are going to be moving on, but before we do so, can we please all show our appreciation to Prem for his wonderfully insightful and very, very thought-provoking session. Thank you very much indeed, Prem. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're either going to go to Brian Basham if he's here, or Helen McGregor if he's not. So is Brian Basham with us? I'm not sure if Brian's here or not. I think we may not have Brian with us. If Brian joins later, we'll hopefully have a chance to hear from him later on, in which case we're going to go to Helen McGregor to invite Helen McGregor to respond to the question, are the UK's financial regulators failing? I think Helen's here. If not, we're going to go to Edward Lucas or Andy Keats. Helen, are you here? If you are, please.
Yes, I am, Andy.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Helen.
I've got a few technical problems, but I will try to get through this. Alexandra's got the slides, I believe.
Okay.
I was going to show. So basically, I'm going to probably cover my 10-minute slot. I'm going to sort of focus on mainly two investment schemes that really demonstrate serious regulatory failure and how we can overcome the problems. Just
yeah, we've got your slides there, Helen. Lovely.
Yes, no, this is overtaking my whole screen. Okay, I can't see a thing. Right. Okay. basically, as everyone probably knows, London Capital and Finance collapsed into administration in January 2019, putting around 11,600 bondholders at risk of potential loss of about 237 million. I mean, this has been a huge financial regulatory scandal. It's had a devastating effect on many lives. The sad reality, though, is that this should never have happened if our regulatory system had been working properly. Clearly, at the moment, we have an independent report. Dame Gloucester was appointed to carry out an investigation into the way the FCA had regulated LCF. I think we've been very comfortable that Dame Gloucester is really independent, and this came across really at the forum she held back in January 2020. So we actually are very confident that she will be giving a fair and independent assessment of what happened. So as you probably know, the report was submitted to the Treasury in November, and it will be, hopefully it will be put in front of Parliament before the Christmas recess, and hopefully it will be properly published. The other regulatory scandal I just want to cover as well is related to the investment schemes marketed by Ready to Invest Limited. And this was a alleged investment fraud covering around 70 investment schemes, marketed and sold to larger UK retail investors between 2004 and 2013. And again, investors have been left with significant financial losses, possibly up to 250 million euros. It has not had the same profile as LCF, but it is significant, and there's been a huge cover-up. We are trying to sort of raise the profile of it at this point in time. So really, where's everything gone wrong? I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. I've put down sort of 4 key areas on this slide. I think, first of all, there's serious failures in the enforcement and supervision team. There's been a recurring pattern whereby you've got retail consumers and you've got IFAs who have been raising serious concerns to the FCA, but they've done absolutely nothing. I mean, this in LCF, we had Neil Liversidge, who spotted that the LCF scheme was not suitable for retail consumers. The FCA dismissed this. And there were many other red flags. Alistair Osborne wrote an excellent article in the Times. Clues to the LCF disaster were all there. There were huge numbers of red flags, such as the overall business model, who they were lending to, the lack of arm's length, the directors in place. I mean, all of these. And yet the FCA did absolutely nothing until December 2018, when they finally launched an investigation, including proposed material was not clear, not fair, and was misleading. So many commentators, of course, felt this action was really too little too late. Stable door shut after the horse had bolted and really run round 2 laps of the track. The R2I case is absolutely no different. In fact, the FCA had full knowledge of serious fraudulent activity from mid-2007 onwards, if not before. Detailed submissions were sent to the FCA about concerns from 2010 onwards, and it was escalated to the then FCA CEO. Nothing happened. And the really sad thing is the fact that the FCA have taken no action, didn't investigate it, has meant that retail consumers have suffered unnecessary financial loss. Because if the FCA had taken action, these schemes would have been stopped and the consumers would not have lost money. With LCF, it's even more serious because rather than protect consumers as required under their strategic objective and ensure market integrity, the FCA did the complete opposite and actually facilitated the criminal activities by granting LCF full regulatory status in June 2016. Of course, this significantly enhanced the credibility of LCF with retail consumers who really invested because it was FCA regulated. If it had not been FCA regulated, the bondholders would, or the retail consumers would not have invested, and that includes myself. So Alexander, if you can slip to the next slide. I'll go back to this slide. I don't know. Alessandra, could you move to the next slide, please? Slide 2. Yes. So this actually demonstrates the huge expansion of bond volumes once the LCF gained FCA status. And there was a huge spike after it was then approved as a ISA manager in November 2017. So you can actually just see the link then between the actions of the FCA and the consumer loss that has been suffered. Okay, so if you go back to the first slide, that would be great. And I have to say, this is also similar with R2I, because with R2I, there was a huge cover up in Jersey involving the Jersey Financial Service Commission. And as a result, the fraud, which is blatantly obvious in the reports that we've seen, was not reported. And there was huge collusion between accountants, between the FCA, between the banks, such that this company, R2I, was able to carry on with its fraudulent activity and defraud other investors, including myself. So if we move on to the next one, flaws in the regulatory landscape. So sorry, no, if you can go back to the slide I was just on, please, that one, yes, that's great. Flaws in the regulatory landscape. So effectively, there's been a lack of perimeter clarity. So the FCA were responsible for regulating LCF's promotional material, which clearly they didn't do very well, because they took 3.5 years to realise it wasn't fair, clear or misleading. But unbeknown to the retail consumers, they didn't regulate the bond and ISAs that LCF was selling. I mean, as far as the retail consumers were concerned, and myself, we were sold fixed rate bonds and ISAs. If you look at the FCA website, the FCA clearly stated they regulated bonds. And some retail consumers even contact the FCA and asked about LCF. They said, no, check the scam warning list. If it's not there, it's good. So off they went, they invested. There was absolutely no qualification on the website saying that the LCF only partially regulated LCF. This is another aspect that really, and I know Sam's listening, but really annoyed the retail consumers. The FCA started referring to these as mini bonds, which was a term that had never been used during the term of this scam. And then the other bit was really what ensuring that the regulation is appropriate to the business model. So here in LCF, you've got quasi-bank activity. I mean, this was really a quasi-bank. I mean, LCF was almost doing what a banking institution does. I mean, it was borrowing from customers, promising to pay a fixed income and actually returning capital. So they managed to get around this with a few exemptions, with deposit and a bond exemption. So it's sort of shadow banking, but certainly this, I think this absolutely has to be addressed. We've then got failures to learn from past failures and implement reform. So, I mean, for example, I know Mark Bishop was involved in the Connaught scandal and in fact set out really improvements that could be implemented and lessons learned that the FCA could implement. That did not happen. If it had happened, LCF may not have ever occurred. We wouldn't have this big scandal on our doors. And I think the other thing is just having this open, honest engagement with retail consumers. I think that another aspect of this was, again, with LCF, we were then told that the ISAs that they sold were not ISAs. Well, we were, all the literature said they were ISAs, but they were non-transferable. And really what the FCA was saying that the retail consumers should have been checking the ISA regulations, the small print, and understanding what was an ISA and what wasn't. But of course, the retail consumers assumed that the HMRC and the FCA had done their job over understanding was an ISA or not. So there was then a load of passing the buck between the HMRC and the FCA. Again, that was incredibly annoying for the retail consumers. And then we've got all this, the cultural challenges, and I think we've discussed about this, a revolving door, putting the reputation ahead of consumer protection and fairness, and the defensive approach. So if, Alexandra, I'm not sure how much time I've got, if you can go on to the slide number 3, that would be fantastic. Yes, so the one after that. Yes, okay, so these are just some of the recent developments. I mean, clearly in the aftermath of LCF, the FCA have made a permanent ban on the marketing mini bonds. That obviously should help minimise the risk of another LCF scandal. We do still have the problem of trying to cut down on the number of rogue firms advertising on Google. Google need to clamp down on that, and that is still, I think, a global problem. We then got this new, the IFPR that's coming in, which hopefully will simplify the processes, and maybe that is something that will actually help address some of the problems that we've been seeing. There was the FCA consultation on the compensation scheme, which I think was not well received. I mean, there is absolutely no basis in law for a cap of £10,000. It then hampers the complaints commissioner. There are all sorts of issues with this, and it means that, you know, the FCA is never really accountable. There's a big asymmetry to FCA being able to make unlimited fines to the financial institutions, and then if they've caused a problem, that they pay next to nothing. So I hope that they will rethink that. We've now got a new CEO, so he's basically said he will pursue justice for customers and maintain high standards. So hopefully he will achieve those goals. We've obviously got the new complaints commissioner. I think Andy Townsend, though, one good thing about that was that we do believe he was very independent, very fair, and he produced some excellent reports. And of course, we've got the independent reports, and hopefully these will drive reform. And you know, as I said, I can't comment on the other reports, but all I can comment on is the Dane Gloucester report, and I have every confidence that will be fair and it will be independent. And if you come on to the last slide, Alexandra, please. Final slide. So really, how can the problems be fixed? So really, cultural change. I mean, and this again, this is very difficult. This is a revolving door problem. We need to change from a defensive organisation, one that is more transparent, one that's accountable, will implement reform, will treat whistleblower evidence more seriously. I think people are very dismissive. They will actually respond much faster, and perhaps there can be some measures about how quickly they respond to these types of you know, whistleblower evidence. And there must be serious penalties, and there must be enforcement for failure to take action on a timely basis. That then ends up with consumer detriment, as has happened with both LCF and R2I. There must be like misfeasance or non-feasance in public office. We talked about the internet promotions. I've talked really about transparency and collaborative approach. I think a joined up regulation, I think Prem talked about this, that absolutely we've got so many, say, dysfunctional organisations or regulators who just seem to protect the members they regulate, and you've got action fraud that are really more inaction fraud. National Fraud Intelligence Bureau have been absolutely hopeless. We've got some liquidators where they've taken so long to assign a claim to us, we've lost £15 million. I mean, this is unacceptable. And then we come on to a simplification as to what the FCA are regulating, which I touched on earlier. So that's, I'll probably again run over the 10 minutes, so I'm sorry, but I think that's it for me.
That really has been absolutely wonderful, Helen. That really has been. So thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sure everybody's appreciated the way you've taken the topic from high level to some nitty gritty detail in relation to some very sad real life experiences that you and many others have experienced. And it's wonderful that you are continuing to battle on as you have been. Folks, yeah, please wave your hand at me if you'd like to say something. Again, I'm going to go to somebody who hasn't spoken yet before we go back to anybody that has. Mr. Alan Salomon, please make your point and be as concise as you possibly can. Thank you.
Good evening, all. Great speakers. It is absolutely diabolical, isn't it, the things we've been hearing? And it's been going on for so long. it's bigger than a tanker that you try and turn on a dime. How can we change it? I mean, that's my question. And I mean, I do have my answers, but they're not easy, obviously. I mean, I'm sure we all have the answers, but if we keep doing the same things as we've always done, as people say, you get the same results. So we have to do something different. I mean, it seems to me that the TTF has a great lobby group, and Andy is doing a lot of this already in scams and transfers and that sort of thing. It seems to me we need to keep on doing that, keep on talking. As far as the FCA is concerned, we need to be talking to them. Yeah, I mean, the answers about how we do it must be quite big. I mean, that's an interesting discussion to have. How do we do things? But I'm sure they're different to what we're doing now. Has anyone got some ideas on that?
I think we could spend a few hours responding to that very, very good question, Alan. All I'll say is we need to think about things strategically. We know that we live in a democracy, and that's a good starting point. So if we know we live in a democracy, we should have a government that's looking after the interests of the public at large. So that's where it's to start. We need Parliament to do what Parliament's asked to do by the people to protect society from all sorts of issues, financial services misconduct being one of them. So we have to find ways to effectively engage with parliamentarians, policymakers, and others who really can drive change forward. Let's leave that one there, but it's such an interesting comment, Alan, and I'm hoping that you and others on this session will be actively involved in contributing to the paper that Mark Bishop is going to lead on behalf of TTF. I think that paper's got potential to be quite useful in many ways. I'm going to go back to Sue Flood. Sue, please make your point for me as succinctly as you can, and of course, take yourself off mute first. Thank you, Sue.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for all the speakers this evening. It's echoing quite some of the things that the pension scam victims have suffered. I've been lucky enough recently, care of Andy, to be able to give evidence to the DWP. Stephen Timms MP has been excellent in listening to victims, which he did on that occasion. I know this is primarily about the UK financial regulators. However, for me, there are enablers that facilitate this alongside everybody else, which start from Companies House, HMRC, the TPR, the FCA, Action Fraud, and the banks. They all facilitate victims' losses. Enforcement teams at the FCA have not dealt with the regulated and unregulated advisors. People were known to the SA back in 2012. They've been allowed to continue to the tune of 4 billion losses, as you're all aware, I'm sure. They've allowed phoenixing firms and CDC firms to act unregulated, causing further damage during this period in time. As for the positive, I found the FCA accommodating and listening this past year, and I'm hopeful for the future. But as anything, unless there's regulatory action and they actually do something with the regulations that are already in existence, we will continuously go round in circles.
So thank you very much, Sue. Thank you very, very much indeed. The point about regulated, unregulated, and the regulatory perimeter has come up several times, and Helen made some very, very powerful points. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put into chat a part of TTF's response to the recent FCA consultation, or I should call it a call for evidence in relation to the investment market. But part of that response included some sort of high-level suggestions about what needs to happen to drive change. So I'll try and get that into the chat. And the regulatory perimeter issue comes up time and time again. I'm going to quickly go to Mark Bishop, and then I'm going to go back to Helen McGregor to see if there's any final comments that Helen would like to make. Mark, I know you could speak for ages, and I know it would be highly informative all the way through, but as concise as you can, please, Mark, please share your thought. Thank you.
Thank you. So Alan Solomon asked a really good question, which is, has anybody got ideas to solve this? I have got, and in fact, I had them in 2014. 2 years into Connaught, I put together a presentation, Helen McGregor very kindly mentioned it, in which I put forward some thoughts on how Connaught could have been prevented from reoccurring and how other scams could be prevented. And it was mostly stuff that the FCA could do without needing any external changes of legislation. I wrote to Martin Wheatley, he refused to meet me to listen to it. I wrote to every subsequent chief executive, including the interims. They have all refused to meet me and listen to the presentation. Twice I've been able to meet with direct reports to the then chief executives, and both of those people have said no change was needed. The first time they said, we're perfect, nothing could be improved. The second time was just after Andrew Bailey's appointment, and the guy then said, well, we've got the mission review. The mission review will fix everything. It's all in hand. We're perfectly capable of fixing our own house. Thank you. And so when, of course, in Helen's presentation, she mentioned that we have a new chief executive of the FCA, Nikhil Rathi, and we hope that he's going to be a breath of fresh air. I should say I emailed him too, saying, would you like to see this presentation? I've got some ideas. Nope, not interested, too busy. I then said, after he'd been speaking about diversity of thought, the need for that, I said, how about just 20 minutes to look at a few slides about diversity of thought? If you like those, you might want to see the rest of the slides. Didn't have time for that either. So, you know, I'm having to say, you know, that meet the new boss very much like the old boss. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that things will change in the new year. I very much understand that he's got to get his feet under the desk. And I also hope that the 2 external reviews that are likely to be published before Christmas will say that things have to change. And perhaps at that point, he might move into a phase of engagement with constructive critics, and particularly victims of financial services misconduct and whistleblowers, because they are the people who really have put everything on the line in order to do the right thing.
Mark, you make your points in such a clear, compelling way. It's what you've just explained is frankly quite shocking. Thank you so much for sharing it. Helen, you, like Mark, have shared your thoughts, you know, from the heart. You've lived and worked through very difficult situations as a consequence of what's happened to you and many others, and you're doing a wonderful job trying to help justice to happen. Can we please, everybody, put our hands together to show our appreciation to Helen for sharing her thoughts today. Thank you, Helen. Very, very well done. Very, very well done. I continue to be very frustrated by the apparent unwillingness to engage. It's such an important point. We're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker. That was great stuff, Helen. Mark, thank you as well. We're going to go to Edward Lucas. Edward has very kindly volunteered to shrink his message just to perhaps just a very short period of time. So can I invite you, please, Edward, just to give us the essence of what you would like to say, perhaps frame what you're about to say as if you were looking after or dealing with one of our Just a Minute rounds. So, so Edward, please unmute yourself and just tell us what you really, really want to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Andy. And I think I would start off just by saying I agree with everything that has been said. I'm sort of both interested and furious. I started writing about this for The Economist 10 years ago in a piece called Sunny Places for Shady People, and was told very firmly that this was the idea that we should reveal the beneficial ownership of companies doing business in the UK was a utopian nonsense, and now that's happening. I also came across this in my writing about espionage when I found that the Russian intelligence service had opened a company's house in the name of an innocent Kent electrician who called Steve, who was Steve Sugden. And when he complained about this, Company's House said it's not our job to verify the information. We just write down what people tell us. And that sort of alerted me to one of the holes in our system. But I think that the big point I want to get across really is this one about when we invented limited liability companies, we never said that these are for concealing identity. Nobody had a debate about this, nobody passed a law in Parliament. We just allowed limited liability, which is a brilliant way of sharing risk between the owners of a company and the people who do business with it, were turned into a vehicle for anonymity. And that's a kind of cancer at the heart of our system. And I think that once you know who owns a company or a trust or any other entity or deal partnership or anything else you're dealing with, then you're in a much stronger position. But the first thing we have to do is to get to grips with this anonymity. And then the second thing I think is liability. And one of the great mistakes that we've made has been allowing professional services firms to incorporate. Because 30 or 40 years ago, if you were a partner in a professional services firm, in a law firm or syndicate, Lloyd's or anything else, if you got it wrong, you were on the hook for the lot with the other partners. You might have to sell your house. And unlimited liability is a very good way of focusing the mind. And limited liability is a very good way of encouraging people to work out, can I tick the boxes right so that I won't actually be prosecuted, and then I will stay out of jail and I'll be gone by the time anyone gets across, and it won't be my fault. And that creates this kind of pass the parcel musical chairs nonsense that we see at the moment, where people do terrible, deceitful, risky things, and it never lands on them personally. And the final point I want to make is that this is basically a national security issue. We've been looking at this in terms of the reputation of our financial system, the fair treatment of people within this country, and so on. But this is a strategic weakness which the Russians and the Chinese and others are using to attack us. The greatest weakness we have is our greed and our complacency. And it wasn't that Russian tanks were crunching down the streets of the City of London saying, we demand that you allow your financial system to be opened to foreign dirty money, and if you don't, we'll open fire. No, we weren't made to do this. We did it to ourselves. We did it in the 1990s because we said the Cold War's over, let's get on with making money. And even if we didn't quite say greed is good, at least we said money doesn't smell. And boy, does it smell. So we are now in a position where powerful adversaries, Chinese Communist Party, the Kremlin, are using these weaknesses in the financial system, which we have allowed to develop, to attack us, to distort our decision making, to bribe our officials and our decision makers, to influence our public opinion. So this isn't just a struggle about having decency and fair treatment within our system and punishing wrongdoers and so on. It's actually a matter of national security. And that's what really depresses me, is that we have yet to get this overlap between economic crime and economic influence peddling into the heart of our system. There's still this idea that you have to protect the city. The city is international, it's buccaneering, it's going to cut a corner every now and again, and therefore we have to keep them on a long leash. And I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think that we have to look at our national security overall and be very tough on the people who, these enablers, the pinstriped accomplices, bankers, lawyers, accountants, consultants, PR people, who are conniving with people who wish this country and our allies harm. And we have to be very tough with them. And if we can't do it through limited liability, we should do it through social censure. And I used to give this speech and say it used to be as bad as to connive with the enemies of our country as it would be working for a foreign arms manufacturer. And there was a bit of a pause in the room. I looked behind me and there was the banner of an arms manufacturer that was sponsoring the conference. And that's why people didn't think my joke was very funny. But I want to commend the FTT and you, Andy, in particular, and Alexandra for holding this. You can find me on the internet, just Google Edward Lucas Contact. You have my phone number is there. Send me a WhatsApp message. Don't send me an email because I won't read it. I get too many. But I'd be delighted to engage with anyone who's at this meeting, who's got tip-offs or ideas that I should write about in the Times or elsewhere. And I wish you a successful continuation of this conference. And my battery is now down to 2% on my phone. So I'm going to stop if I go dark. Thanks very much indeed, Andy, for hosting me. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Edward, for such insight in just 5 minutes. That was wow. That was absolutely wow. You've opened up all sorts of thoughts in my mind. We haven't got time to develop any of the issues that Edward has just run through, but they are definitely points we want to return to. Can I please just invite everybody to show our appreciation to Edward for what he's just been talking through? Really, really important stuff. This is seriously, seriously important stuff. Later on, I'm going to invite Matthew Vincent from the Financial Times to share his thoughts if he wants to squeeze one or two of them in. Matthew, like Edwards, these guys write great stuff that really does very, very often cut to the chase and get to the heart of the matter so well. William May, please do pick up from there if you don't mind jumping in. Thank you, William.
That's not a problem. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you fine, perfectly well.
Good. I've been distributing a report in the City of London today around the major Lloyd's shareholders, but addressing the subject of this particular talk, I believe that the FCA is failing, and it's failing deliberately. I believe that in 2012 it was not properly reformed, that the appointment of John Griffith Jones, who had overseen the wrongdoing at HBOS and in respect of its accounts, that was already a very bad indicator in 2012. As many of you will know, the FCA's principles of business are not properly applied to the banks. As indicated in Andrew Bailey's mission, I think that was a report in 2017, the FCA, rather like the SFO, has a remit which enables it to do pretty much as it pleases. It has been claimed by the likes of Harriet Baldwin, who replied, yes, Andy, to that debate in 2016 on whether the FCA was fit for purpose. She claimed that the FCA is independent of government. I think that the replacement of Martin Wheatley by Andrew Bailey indicates categorically that the FCA is not independent of government. I produced a paper back in February at Andrew Bailey's appointment hearing in front of the Treasury Select Committee, which was challenging his appointment and described 9 separate instances where Bailey had actually covered up or failed to investigate banking fraud. Mention has been made of Nikhil Rathi. I'm afraid I'm more cynical than some of the other speakers and regard Nikhil Rathi as just another gatekeeper who's been installed by the likes of Randall and Bailey, so that in my view, Bailey has got his man appointed to the FCA. Clearly Rathi was one of those people who was at the heart of the Treasury in the 2008 banking crisis. So he's got particular experience there. And as many of you will have seen, one of Rathi's first moves at the FCA has been to clamp down on the compensation payable for the FCA's own regulatory failure and the instigation of a £10,000 ceiling, which is pretty outrageous, much in the same way that the SRA is doing the same thing. So I'm extremely pessimistic about what we're looking at. I believe that in recent weeks, Andrew Bailey has come out saying, amazingly, that he wants even looser regulation, which I regard as outrageous. The report that we've been distributing today contains, well, I tend not to exaggerate, but I believe that this report contains some of the most serious charges ever made against a UK bank. And given the very interesting input from Australia, I regard what is going on in the UK at the moment and this particular incident, which relates to Lloyds Bank, as more serious than both the banking scandals in America or indeed Australia. One of the sections in my report deals with the Australian banking scandal, and I've been through Kenneth Haynes' 530-page report, maybe not as thoroughly as most, but I have had a look at it. And I believe that what we're looking at in the UK is more serious than either that in America or Australia. And fundamentally, I think it is all about the rule of law. Many of you will know that Julian Watts has put in some superb work on bank signature forgeries, and yet the NCA, after 18 months, is still, I think its technical state at the moment is that it is still assessing 427 separate crime reports and 21 files of evidence. So we're operating effectively a two-stage system of justice, which is pretty outrageous. I noticed within the last day or so that President Biden, or President-elect Biden, was talking about respect for the rule of law. And I think the rule of law is another critical factor that is getting brushed aside in the UK. I think we've got a real big problem. And I think one of the speakers was referring to the need for sunshine. I think that, yes, it is the only way to get this sorted out is to shame people nationally and internationally.
William, thank you very, very much indeed. You certainly don't pull your punches, do you? The document that you referred to, that you're circulating recently today, and also the one that you produced, I think you said back in February, can you please get those in electronic form to my colleague Alexandra, so we can circulate them amongst the community and amongst the people who have participated in today's event? I'm sure that many people will find it very, very interesting indeed. Thank you very much indeed, William. We've got time for 1 or 2 questions or comments in relation to what William has said. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to Peter O'Donnell, then Philip Meadowcroft, then Paul Gregory, Steve Farrell. And then hopefully at the end of all that, we've got a good connection with Andy Keats. So please wave at me if you'd like to say something in response to what William has just covered. Helen, please, to you. Thank you, Helen. You'll need to unmute yourself again, bottom left-hand corner.
Yes,
there we go.
I've done it. Yes, just in terms of the complaint compensation scheme, I've worked with, on the LCF committee, I worked with Thomas Donegan, who's a partner at Shearman and Sterling, and he's written an excellent response to that compensation scheme, which I'm sure he'll be happy to share with you. Obviously, it's gone off to the FCA, but it might be worth just circulating that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Please do get that to myself and Alexandra, and we'll definitely do that. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
I'll check with Thomas, but I'm sure he'll be fine with it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to say something at this point that hasn't had anything to say before? Larry Elford. Mr. Larry Elford, how lovely to see you. Larry's one of our non-UK ambassadors. Really great to have somebody like Larry with us. Larry, as well as making your point, please briefly introduce yourself as well, sir. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. That's a real privilege. Thank you.
I'm over in Canada, and I'll be really quick. I agree strongly with William May. If the regulators have a public requirement to act in good faith, then I hope someday the litigators or the court of public opinion will shame them, like William May suggested, and cause some regulators who are found to be not acting in good faith, which I think is easily provable on the record, to provide investors some of their money back. In other words, should the government be liable for your losses if the regulators are acting unfairly? That's the short and sweet from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. There'll be a few folks over here in the UK who don't know you or what you do, Larry. Please do put your LinkedIn connection or something like that into the chat, so those who want to get to know more about you and the amazing work that you do on the other side of the Atlantic can do so. Thank you so much for being with us, Larry. Time for one more quickie, if there is one. Let me see. I'm going to not go to Steve because I want to make sure we give other folk a chance first, and we're so short of time. So can we therefore at this point actually I'm going to go to Mark Bishop, because I think this point's going to be quite important. I can almost read Mark Bishop's mind these days. Mark, tell us your point. Thank you.
Well, I've got 2 points, so I'll make them very quick. The first one is about what Larry raised. In Canada, I understand that the regulator is liable if people lose money unless the regulator can be shown that it was acting in good faith. In the UK, it's the other way around. The regulator is immune from liability unless it can be proven to have acted in bad faith. There is, of course, an argument that perhaps that should be swapped around. The second one is several people have made interesting points today about, the idea of if there was a financial regulators assessment authority or there was some kind of supervisory board or anything like that overlooking the FCA, how could we stop patses and useful idiots from being appointed to that committee? And I think there is a way around it, quite an easy way, which is in small amount of enabling legislation. If you create such a thing, basically you do it by fixing the Financial Services Consumer Panel. You would say that initially a bunch of people would be put onto it who are all victims and whistleblowers. Because the great thing about those people is they've walked the walk and they've talked the talk. Once they're on there, they could then be responsible for appointing their successors. Yeah. Now, of course, if suddenly somebody started bribing them, with nice jobs in the industry, and they started appointing, placemen for the industry, then of course Parliament would have to intervene. But unless that happened, you then let the situation continue to self-perpetuate. That's one way of solving that problem.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm sure that's an idea that will find its way into the document that you're putting together for us. Folks, we're now going to go to our Just a Minute round. For those of you that enjoy Radio 4's Just a Minute, that's the programme that aspires this. We're giving our speakers, Peter O'Donnell, Philip Meadowcroft, Paul Gregory and Steve Farrell, with an opportunity to squeeze the key points into just a minute. Peter O'Donnell, I know you can talk for a lot longer than just a minute. You haven't got much more time than that, sir. Over to you. Your key points, please. Thank you very much indeed, Peter.
I'm going to focus on insolvency practitioners, because what happens is once an FCA regulated company is caught mis-selling and they lose their professional indemnity insurance, they become insolvent, so that they are never held personally responsible. Only the company is held accountable by the FCA. And the IPs, insolvency practitioners of mis-sold investments, do not report to the FCA. They do not take action against directors of regulated companies. They only look to take care of the creditors, people who are recommended to put hundreds of thousands of pounds into scams. Have no rights. They're not seen as creditors until the FSCS pays compensation, and then they replace them as contingent creditors, but nothing goes further than that. I believe insolvency practitioners are a necessary element to look and investigate FCA regulated companies who grossly mis-sold and abused their position of power, but they report to the Secretary of State for Business and the Insolvency Service. They do not report to the Financial Conduct Authority. Once a company, an FCA regulated company, goes into insolvency, the FCA has no interest in them whatsoever because they're no longer regulated. Therefore, they don't come within their remit. And that means that the FCA regulated companies in insolvency and the directors of those companies have no one to report to or be responsible to. We have a big problem in the way the insolvency practitioners work and the ability to obfuscate responsibility by the FCA once a company becomes insolvent.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. That was the most concise you've ever been, and as always, you make your points in such a clear way. It does look to me like there's some regulatory flaw there. How can we let that continue? Thanks very much, Peter. We now go straight to Philip Meadowcroft. Again, the most succinct version of Philip Meadowcroft there's ever been, please, Mr. Meadowcroft. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. A brilliant symposium. I've been jotting down some notes, and therefore I've just got about half a dozen bullet points. We've got to remember the FCA is not a government institution. It operates independently, and it has a notional boss in the form of the Treasury Select Committee. And sometimes that Treasury Select Committee, dependent usually on the chairman, is genuinely inquisitorial. At other times, it is supine. And the FCA is responsible, as we know, for the conduct of regulated financial businesses, but it's funded by those same businesses. If the FCA is failing, how do we get our hands on its throat? Because the FCA needs to command respect, and I think it was William May who mentioned it, quis custodiet ipsos custodies. Who polices the policeman? Three other quick thoughts I had. Remember the Parliamentary Commission on Banking about 7 or 8 years ago? It made the following statement, and I've got to read it. It's like one sentence. The interest rate swap scandals cost small businesses dear. Many had no concept of the instrument they were being pressured to buy. This applies to embedded swaps as much as standalone products. The response by the FCA and FCA has been inadequate. If, as they claim, the regulators do not have the power to deal with these abuses, then it is up to the government and parliament to ensure that the regulators have the powers they need to enable restitution to be made for this egregious mis-selling. The final point, the FCA spent 66,000 on a new logo, hardly different from the previous one, when the letters were previously in an italic font and the new one is in a non-italic font. Remember, the government needs the city and the city needs government. The government needs the city to fund its debt. Most Wednesday afternoons, I think, the debt management office opens up. And the city needs the government to provide a safe and guaranteed return on its cash. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts. We go to Paul Gregory, if Paul is still with us. I think Paul is still with us. Paul, if you are, please share your thought. Thank you. In just a minute fashion.
Just unmuting now. Thank you, Andy. Yes, I've got a few points to make. First of all, it was very interesting to hear that unless we jail the people responsible, we're never going to get anywhere. But the real structural problem is, in essence, the round and round in circles that everybody has experienced. Now, the suggestion of Prem Vida that there was an independent prosecutor rings very true to me, so long as they are funded and truly independent and can do the prosecutions. I mention this because there's a gentleman quite well known internationally called Bill Browder, and he came to Britain with a complete list of all the money laundering in this country and offered it to the police, who were very interested, said, yes, we can deal with this, and they were told to stop. That's it. And I have talked to another very senior police officer in the Met. He said, there are cases where we know we can convict, but we are told to stop. So that means that even if it is supposed to be an independent police, nothing is going to happen. And I really think that it is the independence and accountability that needs to happen. And this multiple 41 people in the financial regulators is total nonsense, and just one is all that's needed, no more than that, so long as they keep their focus and do it properly and are truly independent. Now, everybody that's dealing with the SRA and other social financial is having enormous problems. You just look at the complaints, that means they're not fit for purpose. There is also one other thing, is people are being separated from their courts. The costs of taking on these people is so horrendous that they cannot do it. And therefore it's only via criminal prosecutions that some justice can be done. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thank you. Wonderful. We're going to go straight to Steve Farrell. Steve's always got something to say. So up to 1 minute's worth, please, Steve. Over to you. Thank you.
I'll put my timer on my phone on just to make sure. There's two things. I think one thing is that at root, this is a failure of money. I mean, banking is a racket. There's no doubt about it. It's been a racket since the 1770s, 1830s. Without reforming banking, you're going to get nowhere. We're starting half up the argument. That's the problem. We're looking at regulatory structures to try and fix a system which is fundamentally and totally unsound. And that leads to bad money. The Bank of England has managed to trash 98% of the value of sterling in the last, roughly, well, since 1971, really, since the Second World War. You can't operate an economy like that. Moving on to the FCA, I run a retail financial services business. I'm a partnership. The FCA, without any question at all, can walk in here and shut me down like that with me having no say in it whatsoever. My whole life's work can be destroyed by a capricious bureaucrat on a whim. I have no defence at all. The FCA is not independent, it is unaccountable. It's a racket, just like the rest of it all. Unless you sort that out, you're not going to get any confidence back in the market either. Sorry, my thing has told me I've done a minute. Yeah. Those are my sort of two key points. And therefore, the FCA is not reformable. Any regulatory structure like that is irredeemably, unalterably going to fail. The problem with Prem's idea is you're going to get people sitting on the committees who want to be on the committees. And by definition, they're unsuitable for it, like the Sput-Milligan rule of gun law I put up earlier on. So you've got to find a system which is capable of running of supervision, which is actually going to work. And I don't believe Prem's system will.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Okay, what we're going to do now, folks, is we are going to see if we can hear from some of those who haven't yet had a chance to say something. So I'm just looking at who we've got. I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see who's here. let's hear from, if you're happy to say something, from Bob Ward, from Andrew Candy, from Gareth Roberts, from Michael Gearin, from Leslie Kerwin, from Ian Neal, from Paul Bates. Let's hear from let's hear from those folks first of all, and then we'll see where we are time-wise. Please, literally just 30 seconds worth of anything that you might want to share. We'll go to let's go to Michael Gearin first of all. Michael, I know you're on the other side of the world, so as with Andy earlier, we are very grateful for you being with us. Michael, the key point that you'd like to make would be what, sir? And then we'll go to Gareth Roberts, then Andrew Candy. Thank you.
Let me make a slightly left field point. Those in Australia will know that after the Royal Commission, there was an enormous effort put by Hayne on beefing up the enforcement of ASIC. And tragically, ASIC's enforcement person was a QC who'd been brought into ASIC, and his name was Kremen. He'd been brought up from Victoria. And what do we find with Mr. Kremen? That there'd been a discrepancy about his travelling allowances, and he's resigned from the commission. And what do we find with the chairman of ASIC in Australia, Shipton? There seem to be some accounting fees paid for him that shouldn't have been paid. So we really do, excuse the Australianism, have a bugger's muddle when the very regulator and the top two people in regulation in Australia can't even take care of their own expenses. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say that.
Michael, thank you for making your point so well. Wow. Let's hear from Gareth Roberts, then Andrew Candy. Gareth, great that you're with us. Please share your thought. Thank you.
Yes, very briefly, and thank you very much to all the speakers tonight. My conclusion is basically that our regulators are far too interested in self-preservation and are not willing to deal with the difficult matters, and therefore completely let down the consumer. In my personal experience with them, very rarely did they really get concerned with the losses the consumers have had. They were more interested in just going through their own rules and regulations and ticking boxes. It was very, very frustrating. That's probably enough.
Thank you, Gareth. Super point. Mr. Andrew Candy, thank you for being with us. You're looking cool as always, Andrew. Please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but yeah, just back from the gym. Yeah, I don't think I can really add anything more to what the extremely articulate speakers have already said this evening. They've covered it in some detail, and I'm no expert by any means whatsoever. I've just been suffered at the hands of the FOS and the FCA for the last 12 years. All I would add that there seems to be a ring of obfuscation, and that includes the PRA, the MPC, FRC, FCA, FOS, SRA, ICAEU. There's a whole band of these, including the City of London Police, that just seem to tie things up inextricably for years. And something needs to be done to really address that. And I know Prem's called for a public inquiry, potentially a royal commission, but something quite dramatic needs to be done to really actually take action, because talking about it, it goes around and round in circles. And I think you're making great roads into starting to tackle this straight on, head on, which it needs to be done. So that's all I'd really add to that.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for adding to that. We're going to go to Leslie Kerwin. Then I think that's Brian McMinn we've got. If Brian's there, then we'll go to Bob Ward. Leslie, lovely to have you with us as always. Leslie's a wonderful journalist, and for those of you that don't know, Leslie, to you. Thank you.
I was just going to say that it's probably about 20 years ago that I made a half-hour TV programme about Howard Davis when he was at the FSA. And then a couple of years later, for Moneybox, I investigated the FSA to look at its performance. And I have to say, nothing has changed. We are still talking about exactly the same issues with the FCA. Nothing has changed. What we need is something like a Royal Commission, because otherwise this stuff is talked about among people like us but it doesn't get out to the people that I've just been talking to who have fallen for investment scams and who are, and these are FCA registered, authorized IFAs who are still working, still authorized. They do not understand the issues. We have to get that out there, and the only way to do that is to have a huge public explosion where we explain just how much has gone wrong. And I really think, listening to what's happened in Australia, that is the only way we can make this more public than it is.
Thank you, Leslie. What wonderful points you make. Super stuff. Brian, if you're happy to share your thoughts, please, Brian, go for it. Just take yourself off mute and say what you want to say.
Okay, Andy, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to all the previous speakers. It's very interesting. We're talking and talking and talking, and everybody says we go around in circles. Just let me give you an example, and I shared it with Andy earlier in the week. I had a pension problem. I've lost a bit of money. I'm going to live, I'll survive, I suppose. But I've challenged the pensions regulator just recently. And they've come back to me and they said, okay, we welcome your point. Thank you for that. We'll take notice of it. We might investigate. Maybe we won't. But if we do, we won't tell you what the outcome is. You'll never find out if anything happened at all. No repercussions on anybody. And I think that stems the whole problem we're talking about. Nobody wants to be held accountable for anything. People are just not doing the job they're paid to do. And somehow we've got to change that. People have got to get penalised. The robbers have got to be jailed. They've got to lose all their assets. And I don't know how yet we've got to do it, but somehow we have to do it. There has to be a way. You would never get away with this in private industry. You're accountable for the numbers. You have to make the product, you have to sell the product, you have to get the product paid for. I don't know how we catch these boys, and as somebody said it before, how do we get them round the throat? Because that's where it has to happen.
Ryan, thank you very much indeed. These are such powerful points today. They really are. We're going to go to Bob Ward, who I know has a very strong and very experience-based pensions perspective on things. Bob, please share with us what you'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Good evening, everyone. I like Prem Seeker's paper and his presentation tonight. My fear is that to get that through, the very people who will bring that into some sort of law or something are the MPs, and that we've seen already that MPs are jumping out of their position and going into lucrative jobs when there are regulations within the MP, within the House, that's supposed to be the gap between they do that, and yet they're negotiating while they're still in office. And then we've got the expenses scandal, which they covered up. So we've got to start top down. We've got to police within the actual Houses of Parliament, make sure that MPs are removed if they don't do as they're told. That message will then cascade down. And if they then say, right, well, now we're going to start with the regulators, and we have the oversight that's been proposed, which goes along with all the efforts that I've been putting in, I would support that wholeheartedly, and I think we may well get somewhere at that point.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob. We're going to go Sue Lewis, then Professor Nigel Harper. Sue, I just noticed your note in the chat. Please do share your thoughts verbally as well. Thank you. You might be on mute, Sue.
People usually like me on mute. So I'll make the same points again. FCA board needs to have no industry people on it whatsoever. The revolving door needs to stop. 3 years seems like a reasonable time because people do just rotate those jobs. We started having a chat about, you know, what gets in the way of the FCA enforcing its rules, and they do hide behind Section 348. They claim they hide behind it because it comes from Europe, which is they've got 2 weeks now to run that excuse, or however long. I'm not, yeah. So actually pinning down the FCA, what exactly do they think stops them enforcing their rules, which I agree there are far too many. I mean, I would rather they just enforced against the principles for business and did it properly, rather than all this other, or, you know, because you get this kind of sort of escalation. So the FCA makes a rule, people find a way around it, they make another rule, people find a way, they make another rule, which is why, you know, the rule book's 5 meters high or whatever it is if you print it out. So enforce against the principles for business, do it properly, but that requires intelligent regulation.
So thank you. Can I ask you to comment on a couple of things? One is what is section 348 for those that may not know, and secondly, I believe you're quite positive about the idea of a duty of care or a fiduciary duty. Please confirm that is the case and tell us why. Thanks, Sue.
So section 348 basically stops the FCA publishing anything that it's found out in its line of work, as it were, on its supervision. So it's a little bit like a sort of Official Secrets Act type. And they do get around it when they want to by just asking the banks or whoever to publish stuff, and they can do that. So it's complete nonsense. Duty of care, yeah, well, as you and some others know, I've fought for many years for a duty of care on financial services firms towards their customers, which would have been in effect giving a right of, you know, civil law against something that was very much like treating customers fairly. And the reason that action in the court of law is important is not because a lot of people would do it, but because it ought to make banks stop and think twice. And it would only need a couple of test cases, hopefully, to make a bit of a difference. So that would kind of bring the action forward. I mean, at the moment, the Ombudsman Service will look at whether customers have been treated fairly. It will make judgments against whether customers have been treated fairly. But why should people have to go through all that when a duty of care at the front end of the process ought to avoid it?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. Paul Bates to share his thoughts from Canada. Paul, please do have a word with us about how you see the UK perspective all the way from Canada. Always keen to hear your oversight on what's going on over here. Thanks, Paul.
Oh, my pleasure, Andy. It's been such an informative session, but do not despair. I think there are additional benefits that you could consider in the UK to having effective access to justice by class action mechanisms. Your group action mechanism is very cumbersome. I'm all in favor of a fair dealing obligation on financial institutions, as I think I've written for you, Andy, in other contexts, that is enforceable by civil class actions. And that does add some pressure on financial institutions. Well spoken by all of you, especially the last couple of speakers.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we're going to throw it open now. So so long as you've got a decent connection. Oh, I can see we've got 2 hands up. We've got Hannah and Mark Bishop. And John Gowdy. Oh, let's go to John because you haven't heard from John at all yet. Mr. John Gowdy, please introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you, John.
Good evening, Andy, and good evening to everyone, and thank you for a very informative session. John Guidi from Glasgow in Scotland. My only point is this: where there's a will, there's a way. And quite obviously, within government circles, there isn't the will. And I draw one parallel. The building industry 40 years ago, where people died on building sites, quite a lot in Britain. And the authorities woke up, enacted legislation, and said to construction companies, you will have health and safety on construction sites, failing which, if you have any fatalities, you will be liable to prosecution. And quite simply, where there's a will, there's a way. And we now have one of the best records on building sites. If we had that will, in financial services, we would soon clean up, quite frankly, Andy, what is a swamp. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. We're going to go to Hannah. Hannah, please introduce yourself. Let us see you if that's okay. But either way, please make your point. Hannah, thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Just a few points. In terms of forged signatures, Dr. Rainer Füllmich, who is a dual qualified attorney in California and Germany, has been heading up class action against Deutsche Bank for I think about 8 years and thrashing that out. So that might be a really good connection for whoever's dealing with that. In terms of the FSCS, in my experience, there seems to almost be some kind of shadow books occurring. There's a lot of outsourcing going on. Monies are being funneled to Magic Circle law firms, Grant Thornton, and external agencies, and not going to the victims of these dastardly acts. In terms of everyone saying, you know, what do we do about it? Okay, Andy, I think what has to happen is that this vehicle that you've started has to go more public. And my suggestion is that you have regular live public symposiums in this digital world. And where you know, you've got powerful people like you've got on this evening, powerful, real exposés of this wrongdoing, which is not just, which is the whole, all the tentacles, you know, it's dealing with all aspects of this. And the time is now. It's right now to do this, and you can do, and doing this globally is absolutely superb. The fact that we've got people from all over the world tuning in is awesome. This is the change that's needed.
Hannah, I think you're onto something there. The reality is that social media and technology enables us to do something that was once very, very difficult, which is to bring people together from around the world to speak on matters that really do matter. If it's okay with you, please, Hannah, my colleague Alexandra will organise for you and I to have a chat about that idea, because I'd love to learn more about how you think we might be able to make that work, because my instincts are telling me you're onto something. We're going to go, thank you so much, we're going to go to Joanne Russo next, if we can, please. Can I invite you, Joanne, to unmute if you're happy to, please? You don't have to, but if you're happy to, please unmute, introduce yourself and share with us what you'd like to, Joanne, if you can.
Good evening, everybody. Unfortunately, I cannot share very much because I am in the middle of a complaint about the FCA to the Office of the Complaints Commissioner. I have an ongoing problem with the FCA in covering up the whistles I made. And it's been going on since 2017. And it's a lot to do with, around using Section 348 FSMA to withhold the reports from the public. And there is millions owed to the bank customers. So this isn't something where I've lost money, but I am aware of the crime and I've done as much as I can to expose.
Well, Joanne, thank you very much indeed. Alexander, could you please look to fix up a conversation between myself and Joanne? I think there's an idea that we're working on that might chime with what Joanne has just mentioned. We're now going to go to Sunil. Sunil, please do share your point. Thank you. And then we'll go to Mark Bishop. I'm going to have Mark as the last person making a comment. I would like Mark to reiterate what he said at the beginning about this project we've got on the go that Mark is leading. But before we go to Mark, let's go to Sunil as succinctly as you can, please. Sunil, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for a wonderful meeting tonight. My point is the one that has been made by many, but I work in ocean governance, and I thought I will use a maritime example. Maritime piracy, you know, kept on rising and rising until it was a low risk, high gain profession or activity. And as soon as it became a low risk, high risk and low or uncertain gain activity, then it started to wane. And that's the example I came to my mind. And I think it so fits this situation. Thank you.
You make a very good point in a very creative way. Thank you, Sunil. Mr. Mark Bishop, can you, you do this very well for me, so if you don't mind, have another go at it. Kind of bring together some of the threads you've heard tonight and tell everybody again about this very important project you're leading for us and invite everybody to participate and support it. Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andy, and thanks everybody. It's been really fascinating and also quite humbling. And this is going to sound sycophantic, but I really don't mean it as such. You know, every time I come onto one of these big calls, I'm humbled by the depth of knowledge and the amount of goodwill that there is from good people to reform UK and global financial services. And one of the great frustrations that I have, I'm almost getting a bit emotional now, one of the frustrations I have is that, you know, the FCA, you know, this meeting, this event is about the regulators and 80% of it's about the FCA. And that kind of tells you that there is a problem. The regulator should be talking to us, not only in a spirit of openness, but frankly, one of humility. You know, they have been doing a bad job for a long time. And there is more wisdom in this call to how to fix that than there is around the boardroom table of the FCA, not because they're not intelligent people, but because of groupthink and economic incentives. We can help them with this. Several people asked, I think Philip and Brian particularly, how do we make them listen if they're not prepared to listen to us? I think that there are two ways you can do that. And I think that, you know, if you look at all sorts of organizations like guerrilla organizations that are denied their democratic rights, you know, for example, under apartheid in South Africa, what they generally do is they have a guerrilla arm that sometimes breaks the law. Certainly it does radical and controversial things. And they have a political arm that very much, you know, is about being polite and negotiating and trying to open up, you know, a dialogue and discourse and propose solutions. And I kind of think that's the way that this should work as well. So what I see with TTF is a great font of wisdom that wants to engage with all of the consultation exercises that happen and, you know, wants to talk to the FCA at the top level. But individuals within this organisation who are victims may need to look to other solutions. So in the Connaught case, for example, we talked about how difficult it is to sue the FCA. There is a loophole. The loophole is any person who is an officer of a statutory body who fails to perform their statutory responsibilities, if they cause loss, you can sue them for malfeasance or non-feasance in public office. And in the Connaught case, if the publication of the external review doesn't result in an offer of compensation that's acceptable to us, that's what we're going to do. We're going to sue individual officers, past and present, of the FSA, FCA. Now, they will be protected in court by lawyers who will be paid for by their employer, but they are not protected from civil liability themselves. We can take away their houses, we can take away their savings. So the likelihood is that they'll talk. They will say, well, we were told to do it. You know, we knew that there was a problem here. We asked whether we could intervene. People told us not to intervene. And the more evidence you get as you go up the chain, you can basically prove it's systemic. Once you prove it's systemic, actually, you've got a really big problem. If you've got a very senior person on that witness stand as the defendant or the respondent. And at that point, you know, government has got to admit, bloody hell, we've got a problem with this regulator here. Because of course, if there is the civil tort of malfeasance in public office or misfeasance in public office, probably the crime of misconduct in public office has also been committed. Certainly there is a reason for an investigation. Now, there are some cases, many of them, and I'll say LCF is an example, where what happened was merely negligence. There are other cases, Connaught and some of the bank, you know, cover-ups, where actually it's not negligence, that nothing happened. So I think there are cases where it might need to go down that route so that they realise that there is a need to listen to the political wing, if you like, which is organisations like TTF, and I particularly do mean TTF. That's my personal view on how things might move forward. And to just draw it to a close, which is what Andy asked me to do, this is why the exercise that we're embarked on now is so important. Because it absolutely matters that we put forward a cogent, intelligently argued case to politicians and to the FCA to work in a very collaborative way with us on the solution. We all know this problem. We've got a pretty good idea what the solutions are. Now are you going to talk, and are you going to let it actually happen?
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm going to draw things to a close, but the plan is that we'll be having a symposium like this once every couple of months or so. All the time there's sufficient interest in regulatory reform, we'll make it a major strategic objective of TTF during the course of 2021. And we have to do that because so many issues that we're being told about time and time and time again point to some suboptimality in the regulatory framework, and we need to do something about this. Otherwise things won't get fixed. I've used this analogy before. It's wonderfully simple, which suits my style. Imagine if you walk into your kitchen and you notice a puddle of water on the floor. You think to yourself, okay, I don't want that puddle of water there anymore. I might slip on it. So you go and get your mop and bucket and you clear up the puddle of water. Job done. But you go back 20 minutes later and lo and behold, there's another puddle of water there. So you get your mop and bucket and you clear up that puddle. And then you go back again and the same thing has happened. Eventually, you say to yourself, I need to go and find out what's making this thing leak. And that's what we're trying to do. We are recognizing all the evidence is pointing to a regulatory approach that is about picking up a mop and a bucket and managing immediate symptoms of deep-rooted systemic failures. And that is what we are saying we need to get to grips with. We can't do that on our own. Me and Mark can't do that on our own. But we need loads of other people to contribute to the discussion and debate. We know that we are capable collectively of putting together very compelling papers. And all we're saying is, surely it's time for a great big grown-up conversation involving politicians, policymakers, regulators, everybody that matters. And frankly, everybody matters. Everybody matters. I repeat what I said earlier. We live in a democracy. So let's behave as though that is the case. And let's use all the abilities we collectively have to try to become a force for good, not just for ourselves, but frankly, it's been said before at our events, unless we do something to deal with the systemic issues that are clearly here, then 10, 20, 30 years from now, people are going to be scammed. People are going to be ripped off. There is so much more that we can do. Why don't we look at what the construction industry did to completely cleanse itself? Why don't we look at the way the airline industry works? Every time a plane is down, they forensically look at, okay, what exactly went wrong and what do we need to make sure that that can never happen again? We are failing to use the power of deterrent. We are failing to use the regulatory powers that have already been granted. Why? Loads of questions, folks. And I just want to close by saying thank you all very, very much indeed for being part of what we're trying to do. We really have had some outstanding speakers, including Prem Seeker, Andy, all the way from Australia. I am so proud to be involved in this. I see my role as being to facilitate and organize. I haven't got the brains like many of you have, but frankly, I don't need to have a great big brain because I know the people that have. Let's all play a part in trying to make a difference. I believe that we can. I would not be making the sacrifices I make unless I was absolutely convinced that we could make a difference. I believe we already are in some way. Let's carry on using each other's energies to try to do what needs to be done. On that note, we're going to close the session. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you. Wonderful.